If you are watching this, don't just scroll past. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to tell you is not a story I made up. It's something that actually happened to me. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I used to work as a freelance journalist covering small-town stories that most newspapers wouldn't bother with. Missing pets, old legends, abandoned buildings, those were the kinds of things I chased. But one night, after finishing an assignment in a forgotten rural town, I became the story myself. I know how crazy it sounds, but I swear to you, I was hunted by something not from this earth. That night, I was driving back along a desolate highway in northern Arizona, a stretch of road where the desert swallows everything, and you can drive for hours without passing another soul. The air was heavy, the kind of silence where even the radio static feels like a scream. My old Ford made that steady humming sound, and I was half drifting into autopilot when the first strange thing happened. In the corner of my eye, far out over the sand, I noticed a light. At first, I thought it was a distant plane or maybe a tower beacon, but then it shifted. It wasn't just hanging there. It moved, fast, cutting sharp angles like no aircraft I've ever seen. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, and my stomach dropped when the light suddenly disappeared, only to reappear, closer, brighter. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Don't panic, Dan," I told myself. "It's nothing." But deep down, I already knew it wasn't nothing. A few seconds later, the sky lit up like a flashbulb, a cold white glow that turned the desert floor into a sea of pale glass. And then, hovering just a few hundred feet above the ground, I saw it. A disc-shaped craft, silent, smooth, without wings, without rotors. The light came from its underside, not a spotlight but something else, something that seemed to bend the air around it. I slammed the gas pedal, the Ford groaning as it picked up speed, but in my rearview mirror the light followed. No engine roar, no dust trail, nothing. Just that impossible machine gliding after me. I drove like a madman, swerving across lanes, praying for another car, a gas station, anything. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, but the road stretched endlessly, the desert mocking me with its emptiness. Then it happened. The car's engine coughed and died as if someone had reached inside and switched it off. The headlights flickered, the dashboard went dark, and I was left coasting in dead silence until the Ford rolled to a stop. I fumbled for my phone, but it too was dead, black screen reflecting my terrified face. That was when the beam hit me. A column of bluish-white light poured down from the craft, enveloping the car. I tried to move, to open the door, to run, but it was like my body no longer obeyed me. My arms felt weightless, my head heavy, and before I could even scream, I was rising. The car shrank below me, the desert spun away, and then there was only light, swallowing me whole. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying on a cold surface, flat and metallic, in a space that didn't make sense. The walls were curved, seamless, glowing faintly like the inside of a pearl. I wasn't alone. Shapes moved around me. Tall, thin silhouettes, their heads elongated, eyes dark and too large for their faces. They didn't speak, not in words, but I felt pressure in my mind, like thoughts brushing against my own. Panic surged, and I tried to sit up, but something held me down. Not straps, not metal, just force. The figures leaned closer, and that was when I realized they weren't just watching me. They were studying me. I remember the pressure in my chest like someone had their hands on me, squeezing until my thoughts blurred. The beings, if that's the only word I can use, moved with a calm precision, like lab technicians at a station. One reached out with a limb that looked almost arm-like but more delicate, with fingers that tapered to points. It hovered over my temple, and the sensation wasn't physical pain so much as a flicker of images. A road sign, an old photograph of my father, the smell of coffee in a motel room. It was invasive and intimate, like they were rifling through the drawers of my memories. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but sound came out thin, useless. Then, in my head, a voice or a pattern of impressions arrived, not in English but stitched into meaning so clearly I could not deny it. Curiosity. They were curious, not malevolent in the human sense, but wholly indifferent to what that curiosity might cost me. Time, if I'm honest, lost its edges inside that room. Minutes folded into hours and then folded again. I could sense procedures, light, a soft hum, instruments tracing arcs across my skin. When they scanned my hand, I could feel every seam of bone, as if someone had switched my perception to a microscope. They watched me look back at them with that raw, animal panic. One of them paused and the pressure shifted to something softer, almost like a question. I thought of my mother and the times she told me to be curious about the world, to ask questions. The irony hit me as suddenly as it landed. I had spent my life seeking stories about other people, and now I was the story they read without permission. Eventually the pressure ebbed. They lifted me gently, if their version of gentle counts, and carried me through corridors that hummed with a low, tonal noise I could feel in my molars. The craft was larger than I first imagined, with catwalks and observation bays and an architecture that avoided right angles in favor of flowing arcs. Through one opening, I glimpsed the desert like a toy landscape far below, and the realization that I was suspended between two heavens made my stomach turn. They brought me to a chamber that felt like a greenhouse, except the plant life was wrong. Thin fronds pulsing with light, filaments that caught and refracted the hum. One of the beings placed something on my forearm. A band, translucent, with veins of light knitting into it. When it touched my skin, I felt 1,000 tiny tugs, as if a foreign gravity had settled into my blood. Then came images again, but this time they were not mine alone. Flashes of other places. Vast oceans under violet skies, cities arranged in spirals, creatures that swam through air, surged through me. I did not just see them. I felt the logic of their existence, the geometry of their ecosystems, as if a library of living maps had been opened and I was being shown excerpts. My first stupid hope was that they were sharing knowledge. Maybe that's what it was, some exchange beyond language. But buried in that data was a pattern of movement, a cartography of routes, and a sensation like a thread being pulled taut toward Earth. It didn't feel like they were here to teach. It felt like they were marking. An archivist catalogs, a hunter charts. I could practically taste the cold calculus of it. I tried to wrench my thoughts away, to hold on to the part of me that was human. My fear, my anger at being made small, but the band made thoughts diffuse, like oil on water. There were things they couldn't get directly, names, the precise warmth of my daughter's laugh. Those stayed stubbornly mine, protected by some internal lock I hadn't known I had. That realization sparked a new kind of terror. If some things remained private, what exactly were they taking? Hours later, or maybe less, maybe more, they moved me again. This time the chamber was lined with glass and I could see panels where other humans, or human-shaped forms, drifted, connected to similar bands. Faces, some older, some young, eyes either closed or fixed on nothing. I recognized one man's tattoo, a small anchor on the wrist. It was the same mark I'd photographed years ago for a series about sailors who never made it back. Memory overlap. They were not random victims. My journalist brain, even drugged and half-rotten with fatigue, began to map motives. Selective? Patterned? The realization cooled to something like professional curiosity. If they were picking certain people, why me? Was it proximity, some electromagnetic signature from the Ford, or the type of life I had lived, always traveling, always looking? Before I could answer myself, they placed something in my hand, a small object that glowed faintly. When I focused, it was a lens, but not like any glass I knew, more like a shard of captured starlight. As soon as it touched my palm, an image bloomed. A woman, mid-30s, smiling crookedly, a child on her hip, my neighbor from the motel where I'd stayed 2 nights earlier. Panic bloomed anew. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream. The beings watched, expressionless. Then, in my head, a pattern that felt like a map of intentions. Markers placed on human networks. Families, occupations, those who observed. The shard was a pointer. I understood that they had ways of tracing connections through the lives of people like me. They were not just taking bodies. They were taking threads that knit the world together. And in doing so, they were learning how we fit into our own small ecosystems. I realized with a cold certainty that the band on my arm pulsed in response to the shard, linking me into something larger, a lattice I could not see but was now a part of. For the first time since waking, rage rose through me. Not just fear, but fury at being reduced to data. I forced my jaw shut and bent every scrap of willpower to respond. If they cataloged us, I would become a cataloger too. I began to observe, to memorize the shapes of their hands, the cadence of their non-language, the rhythm of the hum. I measured distances and counted silly, human things, but they kept me tethered to my own mind. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe the band couldn't reach everything. Whatever the cause, it worked. I started to plan the only thing a man with nothing but his wits can plan: escape. I worked my plan into the smallest pieces I could: memorize, wait, move, because grand gestures are for movies and they get you killed in real life. First, I tested the band. When the nearest being leaned over, study face as always, I let my fingers twitch and feigned incoherence until it relaxed its grip on me. Then, when the corridor outside was quiet, I inched my hand toward the band and rubbed at the seam with a fingernail until something gave. Tiny, excruciatingly slow progress that felt like trying to peel varnish off with your teeth. The band was smart. It corrected for force, but it responded to attention in a way I could exploit. I learned to create tiny interruptions, blink patterns, micro-twitches, that seemed to confuse whatever signal fed the band just enough to dull the pulse. It wasn't full freedom, but it bought me seconds. Seconds were everything. Over the next cycle of their observations, I watched how they moved with each other, how they escorted the other humans from one chamber to another, how one of the beings, slightly larger with a scar-like ridge along its head, seemed to be the decision-maker. I cataloged rhythms of meals, if meals you could call them, thin coils of nutrient gel that hummed at the tongue, and the rotations of centuries. I marked a window of low attention that came midway through whatever their sleep equivalent was. The night I chose, every motion felt magnified by the force of risk. I'd managed to smuggle a shard of softness from a draped plant. Its filament loosened into a cord, and I used it to wedge the band's seam while the larger being turned away. For a breathless moment, my arm felt like mine again. I didn't flinch. I pushed. The force that had pinned me eased, then snapped like ice underfoot. I collapsed to the floor and rolled, crawling toward the door as the hum spiked into a warning tone. The alarms were internal, tactile. I felt them along my teeth as a vibration that made me nauseous. I reached the corridor and ran, barefoot on metal that burned like a skillet. Lights flared, and their shapes converged. I had to improvise. I lunged into a side alcove where a glass tube held something that looked like a sleeping form. Inside it, to my horror and a strange burst of hope, was a woman I recognized from a grainy roadside portrait. Kara, the schoolteacher from the town I'd been in last week. Her chest rose and fell. She was alive but sedated. I smashed the tube with my shoulder and hauled her out, her limbs limp but breathing. The act set off a cascade of responses. Doors that had been passable sealed with a hiss. The beings moved with that same clinical calm, but now with speed. One grabbed my shoulder and the pressure in my head knifed into pain as they shouted. Not in words but in coordinated concept, and I understood the gist. Confinement breach, unauthorized contact, destabilizing vector. They were angry, but not in the way a human is angry. There was disappointment in it, like a scientist whose experiment has been disturbed. I shoved Kara at the first open hatch and pushed myself through after her. The corridor led to a hangar-like bay and I saw, impossibly, the outside. Stars so wrong, so densely packed that constellations I didn't know stitched into the black. Beyond that, the desert rolled like a pale rug. The exit was a narrow shaft, and the beings funneled to cut us off. We made it to the shaft and began to climb. My arms burned, my fingers tearing on the composite ladder, and the band on my wrist pulsed with a frantic rhythm as if warning me of an internal lockdown. On the last rung before the hatch, a hand closed around my ankle. I swung and kicked, felt something give, and the grip was gone. I crawled through the hatch and flung myself into the hot desert air. Rocks stabbed my palms as I rolled. Kara coughed, then vomited, then looked at me with eyes clearing of sleep and whatever sedation they had applied, and for a second she looked like the person in my photos. We ran. The craft remained above us, an impossible moon, and a thin net of light skated the ground in search patterns. We ducked behind a shale outcrop and pressed ourselves into its shadow while my lungs burned. I thought we'd be safe if we could just put distance between us and that humming leviathan, but the world had been rewritten. My phone still didn't work, the stars seemed angled like a map I couldn't read, and something rubbed at the inside of my skull. A mapping of routes again, like the band was still trying to stitch data into me. Kara grabbed my hand. She could speak, and her voice was small and raw. "They take threads," she whispered in a voice that was not quite hers yet. "They stitch us." She told me, in broken bursts as her memory returned, that the beings had been watching patterns for decades. Migrations, food chains, lines of trade, the invisible scaffolding of human life. They weren't random, they were strategic. They marked nodes. Storytellers, connectors, people like me who mapped the small and overlooked. Those nodes, she said, made a map that allowed them to move unseen, to slide between human systems like a finger between pages. My anger, which had been a useful tool, curdled into something else, an obligation. If they were harvesting networks, then the harvest would leave gaping holes in communities, unanswered questions, missing children, towns with stories that ended abruptly. We could run, but running wouldn't stop them. We had to know more. I wanted to go back, to get proof, to document the pattern and publish it, to turn their methods into noise. It was a mad, dangerous thought, but journalists are built of such dangerous nonsense. We crept toward the one thing neither of us had, a vehicle. The Ford was where I'd left it, a black shape in the moonlight, and it was still sitting where it had been disabled. I prayed the band's link had been severed when I'd broken free. As we approached, a low thrum began in the air, different from the craft above, lower, resonant, and from the dark came silhouettes moving faster than the human I should allow. They didn't chase like predators. They closed like sealers, folding the desert into compartments. We were surrounded before we knew how it had happened. The beings didn't hesitate this time. The larger one stepped forward, and in my head its image resolved into a concept I could almost name: steward. It looked at us for what felt like an entire life, and then, to my infinite disgust and horror, it smiled, or its version of a smile, an angle of the head that internalized something like amusement. "We are cataloging," thought voice washed over me, but there was an edge now, a new layer, behavior. "We are learning what resists." They lifted us again, but this time the craft's interior was different. More clinical, more permanent. I realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade, that my small act of rebellion had become a variable in their study. I had been observed escaping. Now they would observe the consequences. They brought us back to the room where it had started, the same pearlescent walls, the same steady hum, but everything felt smaller now, like a stage after the actors have left it. The larger one, the steward, stood by the entrance, watching. Kara and I were placed on benches opposite each other, still shaky, still tasting copper from dried blood and desert sand. The band on my arm had been reattached, but this time it sat looser, as if they'd adjusted a strap rather than welded a shackle. The steward tilted its head and the pressure returned, not invasive now but interrogative, probing the shape of the choices we'd made. In my head, clearer than any language, came a map of consequences. The threads we'd ripped, the markers we'd left, the noise our escape had generated across whatever network they used to read the world. For a moment I felt like a man who had reached across a dark river and, in doing so, had tugged at something anchored deep beneath the surface. The steward conveyed something like regret and curiosity folded into a single concept. Observation increased. They were not punishing us in their way, not through pain but through attention. Our faces, our small acts of rebellion, would now be catalogued with greater fidelity. We were variables in their long experiment. Then, as suddenly as darkness sometimes clears, the bench dropped away and we were outside, the desert night stealing air into our lungs like forgiveness. The craft vanished in a blink, not with the thunder of a rocket but with the polite absence of something folding itself into a pocket of sky. Kara and I sat on the hood of my Ford and watched the stars settle back into their usual, less crowded patterns. We did not speak for a long time. When we finally did, our words were small and practical. Names times what we remembered. We swapped fragments the way sailors swap rope knots and learned quickly to fit those fragments into a coherent rope we could use. The shard from the craft still sat in my palm, warm and impossibly small. It hummed faintly against my skin, a memory of light. I wanted to keep it as proof, as a stubborn piece of impossible geometry I could show to the world, but every rational part of me knew what such proof would do. Label me crazy, invite men with suits and questions, maybe even start a hunt that would bring more attention to the very thing we wanted to obscure. Instead, I swallowed the shard whole. It was an animal decision, irrational, final, in line with the only option left to a man who had been catalogued. Make yourself unreadable. It was the kind of choice that feels right in the moment and may be catastrophic later. The shard slid down my throat like a coin, and for an instant there was a heat that spelled memory inside my chest. Then it was gone, and all I had left were the impressions it had left on my mind. Over the next days, we reconstructed our lives around a new axis. Kara returned to her town and I returned to mine, but both of us came back altered. I filed my notes, wrote a piece that I couldn't publish, and kept a private ledger of names and places. Nodes I had seen in the craft's glass chambers, faces I'd recognized from old assignments. I handed copies to no one, but I copied them carefully on paper, on drives, in ink that would survive a hard reset of the mind. People online called me a hoaxer when I posted fragments of the story. Friends avoided me. My editor at the local paper emailed once, asking if I was okay, then never followed up when I couldn't bring her the kind of evidence their newsroom would accept. The more I tried to make my experience fit into the world's categories, the more the world refused the fit. It was infuriating and isolating and, in a perverse way, accurate. They had taught me the architecture of disbelief. But life has a way of pressing forward. Months later, I received a postcard with no return address. A photograph on glossy paper of a small diner 2 towns over, circled in ink. On the back, a single line, "We are not alone, but we are not helpless." It was signed by Kara. She'd been building a network quietly, gathering people who had gaps in their memories, people whose lives had tiny holes where something had been taken. We met in secret, in empty church basements and late-night diners, swapping stories and lists, comparing the artifacts we still carried. An old map with routes circled, a bracelet that hummed under certain moons, a patch of skin that would flare when specific frequencies played on a radio. We learned to spot the lattice before it closed around us. We taught one another how to pull a band loose, how to mimic the microtwitch that confused their sensors for a few precious seconds. We traded techniques for erasing metadata on phones, for creating plausible holes in histories, for making ourselves less legible. Some nights the group sat in a circle and I read aloud from my private ledger, because stories, even impossible ones, stitch communities tighter than fear does. I began to thread what I knew into articles disguised as folklore, as warnings disguised as fiction. The truth had to travel in code. The world, predictably, ignored me until it couldn't. A string of disappearances in a cluster of small towns, teachers, journalists, mid-level connectors, caught a federal agency's attention. A journalist with more reach than I had started asking better questions. The stew of pressure and curiosity they would all be reading right now gathered like a storm. I helped where I could, But I kept one rule. Never point directly at the lattice. Expose the pattern, not the map. The steward had taught me that much. When you aim at a thing, it learns how to hide. And so we became librarians of rumor, archivists of rumor that could be used to warn without illuminating the exact mechanics. Months slid into a year, and the band on my wrist occasionally flared. Always at dusk, always for less than a breath. I learned to expect it and to treat it like a bruise. Notice, mark, move on. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of their ship in my mouth and a clarity about small things. The angle of a road sign, the way a neighbor always left their porch light on. Other times the bands stayed cold and quiet. If there is a finality to tell you, it is this: we did not stop them. We made it harder for them to take at random, and we made ourselves, our towns, our stories less transparent. That was all we could do with the leverage of our particular kind of knowledge. The craft came back twice more after that first night, both times in forms and places we couldn't have predicted, both times causing gaps that would never quite stitch back the same way. Each time the steward watched and cataloged and, I think, learned. So did we. As for me, I kept writing. I put the footage I could salvage online, behind layers of fiction and disclaimers. Some people believed. Most did not. But an unexpected thing happened. Children started asking different questions, and that changed everything. When a child looks up at the sky and asks not, "Are we alone?" but "Are we kind?" the question contains a demand that cannot be easily shrugged off. They will grow up less readable to whoever reads patterns. They will hide threads in plain sight. I like to think that's how the tilt begins, the slow cultural work of making a species harder to catalog. The last detail I will leave you with is small and private. Sometimes, when the desert wind hits right and the night is very quiet, I can hear a tone under all other noises, a low harmonic that threads through the teeth of the world. It is not the hum of the craft. It is their listening. If you ever find yourself under that note, do not panic. Learn to be messy. Learn to be ordinary in ways that confuse a scanner. Tell stories that contradict each other. Keep your lists on paper and your memories in different rooms of your brain. Love loudly and unpredictably. They map patterns. People patch them. And if you are watching this, don't just scroll past. Share it with someone who keeps lists and someone who burns them. If you want to know more, I will keep telling what I can. But remember, every time you pull a thread, something learns how to knit.